Here is a purple ink by Vinta Mulberry Ubi.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
A great darker purple that, looking at the swatch, has some sheen, but I never see any sheen in any of the writing samples. There is some tone variation by pen, but the tone variation arrives in a completely expected way, making it really no issue at all. It technically does shade, not in a standout way most of the time, so I don't see it being a go-to type quality for this, even though it is present. I will say that all of the tones it gives are very nice and thankfully don't show as a blue lean, but just stay as a purple. If you like purples, or even if you don't, I think this is a must try.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M800. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a nice darker mid as purples go. This is not a dark purple, but it's certainly not light in itself. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get little bits of shading that show up, and you see it comparing on the second line, the to unknown, where the is quite a bit darker in majority, though the T at the beginning of it is a little bit lighter, and unknown returns to that lighter tone where the K gets darker, back to the lighter tone, where smell goes from a lighter to darker tone. A very keen thing to happen when you look at keen right next to it, going from darker to lighter. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker in tone than the extra fine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading that it's definitely there. It's really spots that go on that catch your attention, like catch on the first line. The C and the H are just a little bit darker than the rest of the word. What underneath it? The H is a little darker than the rest of the word. And cried on the third line has a darker C and D than the rest of the word. But all of these darkers are only a tiny bit darker than the rest of the word. Really something that if you tend to like shading, you're going to see it. And if you don't, you probably won't. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, with no feathering, with no spread, with nothing for shading. It's just the darker tone that occurs in a great deal of the medium. I'm going to take back the shading just a little bit because you see moments of tiny bits like the end of the B in proverb on the second line, or the H of though on the second line right next to it. There is little bits, but really not a standout thing in any way, something you could almost miss. Looking at the back of the page, I'm pointing at little spots where it definitely got deeper into the paper, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath. And in fact, even with these darker spots that I'm pointing to again, the ghosting is not anything that would stop you from using the back of the page.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We do get shading, and not in an uncomfortable way. Looking at uncomfortable on the first line, you see that the un is a nice midtone. The C gets darker, back to the midtone on the OM, but the beginning of the F is much darker than the rest of the, or the bottom forward of the F, where it stays in the midtone until you get the bull at the end, that BLE. That situation being mostly a midterm, but both of the T's being much darker than the rest of the word is very pleasing on the eye. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine, yet flatter as a tone, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading that shows up, I think, nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine. I think the flatter tone is really helping it out. When you look at hunting, the H is a little bit darker, so is the T and the bottom of the G, where it crosses the H of had, where the H and the D are darker than the middle A and beginning of the D. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine, flatter just as it was with the medium as compared to the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, definitely is showing some shading to be found here. Look at found on the third line. Starts darker, becomes mid-tone throughout most of the word, but the end of the D is much darker. Shading here much better than it did on the Clairfontaine with the stub. Looking at the back of the page, being very dark, you do see that there's some very, very light ghosting. Nothing that would stop you from being able to write back here, and nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but really appearing as a flatter, dustier tone. Not just flat and not just dusty, but certainly both flatter and dustier. No feather, no spread, little bits of shading showing up. You see it in high on the second line. Both of the H's are darker than the IG right in the middle, where branches underneath the B and the he are darker than the rest of the word. Even the S at the very end lightens up and then gives a spot of dark just at the bottom. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It has shading that peppers the beard of... I lost it. I was going to try and use beards. We're going to go with beards on the third line. I lost the way I was going to try and do it. I've been trying to do that a little bit. Looking at beards, you see it starts very dark on the B, becomes a lighter a little bit at the E, and darkens up just a bit more on the EA, or on the E, or on the AR. Slight lighten up at the beginning of the D, very dark at the end of the... I'm going to move on because, man, am I struggling with this one. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. Still really dusty, still really flat as a tone, slight bit lighter than what we're seeing on the Clairfontaine. It does feather. We see it in Feely and Keely on the second line, where at it there's a lot of feathering, really tiny the whole way through, but definitely there. Not so much for spread, though. I do think that because this paper doesn't always, or doesn't very often feather much, this is not a great ink to use on it. Now for shading, there's really almost nothing. There's a couple of spots, maybe it's a little bit darker. but with the darker, it gets more feathers. Look at the downstroke of the T on at, right center line, top line. It is a little darker and a little more feathering. They really stand out. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there's it got really deep into this paper in all three of them. I do think you could write on the back of the page with the extra fine. I probably wouldn't with the medium or the stub, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath, so at least it's got that on its side here.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is more shading than we saw on the last page. Taking a look at more, where it starts as a midtone, darkens up, very dark at the O, then becomes a nice midtone at the R, very dark again at the E. It's a comfortable thing. Looking at comfortable, that starts darker, lightens up into the OM, the F gets darker, and the fort of the fort is a lighter tone where the bull, BLE at the end, darkens up again. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine, just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread. Now, the medium on the Clairfontaine had no feathering, but here it definitely has some shading that goes on, just little spots that spokes their way out. Looking at spokes on the first line, the S, that P, very dark, where the S and the O are a slightly lighter tone. The KE quite a bit darker, where the S starts lighter at the top and very dark at the bottom. Of right next to it, lighter in the beginning through the midway of the F, but on the way down, it darkens up and gets very dark at the very end of the F. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it does shade, and you can really find it when you look at find on the third line. You see that it's a nice mid-tone through the beginning of the F, but it's the upstroke of the F at the end where it really darkens up into the I, then going back to a mid-tone until we hit the D, a fine place. Looking at place on the third line, where the downstroke of the P and the downstroke of the L are both much darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is a purple ink by Krishna Sea and Storm. Here is a purple ink by Noodler's American Aristocracy. Here is a purple ink by Sailor Kobe number 18. Here is a purple ink by Schaefer Purple. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a lighter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. It is a dustier tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. As far as shading goes on, we certainly see shading. You see it a lot. Really, I'm going to focus on the third line, where found starts as darker, goes to a mid-tone, then very dark again. Tree works its way lighter to darker into dark to mid-tone to dark at the 2 at the end, where witch starts mid, gets dark at the H, at the itch, lightens up again. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It has no feather. It has no spread. Its shade is not hidden when we look at hidden on the second line that starts as a darker tone, lightens up into the ID, but the up-down stroke of the D, much darker, lightening up again until we get to the N. Pretty good. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than on the Clairfontaine, still very dusty. No feather, no spread. I want to say the shading shows itself much better here than it did in the medium. Those thicker lines are really working out for it, the kind of squeegee effect of that stub nib working to an advantage here. Take a look at into first line, lighter on in, very dark on two. That's about the kind of shading that you might want when you look at about. Starting light, the B, it gets a little bit darker, lightens up into the OU, and the T quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, making this really good for students.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a green ink by Diatramentis Artist Ink Green. Here is a gray ink by Mont Blanc Oyster Gray. Here is a pink ink by Diamine Flamingo Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Krishna Freedom Gold. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same darkness that we had with the Clairfontaine, largely the same tone. We get feathering and we get spread, and the feathering at certain times is certainly much worse than others. On it, the feathering is horrible. Looking at the K in looking, there's a lot of feathering. The spread that's going on has this out at about the medium. Now, the feathering and the spread together, I do not see as a deal breaker on this paper. The paper is the deal breaker, and shading, there is none. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, a whole lot darker, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers a bunch. Yes, it spreads a bunch. Something to think about, like think that you'll see on the third line has a ton of feathering and spreading in it, really making you doubt what's going on. Maybe we shouldn't call it feathering. We should call it leaves, like trees has on the second line. So many feathers, so much, a tree filled with birds. Shading, there's none, but it is a great color. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tiny bit darker than it was with the medium, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. I think the feathering and the spread here both look better than it did on the extra fine or the medium. So this to me is a better case for this ink with this paper. Shading, we're not having any, which to me on copy paper usually comes across as a good sign. Looking at the back of the page, you see that you can't write back here. You're going to lose both sets of notes, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath. Nothing at all. And I'm really surprised. And I'm focusing on the medium because, man, that was deep, but it never corrupted that next spot. So good performance on crappy paper.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine is a nice lighter tone, but not a light tone of purple. It has just a light peppering of shading throughout. The medium is slightly darker than the extra fine, but the shading is more pronounced and in general better. The stub gave the same tone as the medium and the same level of shading as the medium. but the darker parts of the shading just seemed a little bit darker. So there's not a huge difference from pen to pen, setting this up to really be a dealer's choice. Yet for me, I just skip the extra fine experience with this. There's a slight difference from the extra fine to the medium, but there is a difference.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you're not subscribed, I would invite you to do so now.